Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. My name is Alison, the online piano and the online violin tutor. Now, I wanted to talk to you in this video about my 7-step guide to learning a new piece of music. Now, this came up in one of the comments quite a while ago. I'm sorry I can't remember the person who asked this, but I thought it was a good idea and I made a few notes, which I will be reading off here. So there's quite a lot of them, but I made them so I don't kind of go off on a tangent. And I wanted to talk to you about how I go about learning a piece of music. And I've kind of broken it down into 7 steps. Before we do go any further, I just want to point out that these are my steps that I personally take. Some of you might think a little bit differently and that's absolutely fine. But this is what I do and I'm sharing this with you guys. So, the first thing I do is listen to the piece of music that I'm going to be playing. So I would listen to it first via a recording of some sort. Now, I would do that probably on YouTube. I never used to when I was younger. I just had CDs and things. We didn't really have YouTube way back in the day. But nowadays we've got access to lots more things. So I would probably try to find a recording of Maxim Vengroff. He's one of my all-time brilliant violinists. Itzhak Perlman or Anne-Sophie Mutter, one of those, for example. There's lots of other players, but those are just the top 3 that their technique really resonates with me and I really like how they play. Probably Maxim Vengroff being the best one for me. Anyway, so if I could, I would try and listen to one of them play it. And what this would do is give me inspiration and help me understand how and where the piece goes and any other parts that I was or I am not familiar with. So if you hear a piece on the radio or on YouTube or in another video or, you know, whatever it is, and sometimes you only know like the first little part of it or the first kind of introductory part of it, but you don't know the rest of it. So that's when I would go and listen, preferably with the music in front of me. I always like to have the music in front of me when I'm listening to said chosen violinist play the piece of music. This obviously goes for the piano as well, or any instrument. There are people that don't encourage you to listen to music because they feel that it influences you before you've started off playing. But my argument to that would be, if you listen to someone who inspires you, someone whose playing is very kind of similar to yours in a way, or someone who, I should say, interprets music very similarly to how you would interpret the music, then I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all, because there's no way that I'm going to listen to a recording of Maxim Vengroff and then 10 minutes later I'm going to be stealing everything that he does in all of his interpretation and playing it exactly the same way that he does. That's going to be long forgotten in my brain, but it just kind of, it inspires me to want to be able to play like that. So that is step 1. Okay, so once we've listened to it, we're actually going to be getting on to the playing. So notes, the actual music notes. So at this point, I would busk it through. Some of you might not know what I mean by busking. So busking just means kind of very poorly having a little play through, trying to get from start to finish as much as possible, just so that you can just get an idea of what you're doing. There's going to be no finesse in there. It's going to be horrendous, but you're just going to be kind of busking it through, so to speak. Just start from the beginning, try and get your way to the end somehow or another, and that way you can get a whole flavour for the piece all in one go. I wouldn't be paying attention to positions, fingerings, bowings, dynamics, any general directions, absolutely nothing. And I think depending on the difficulty of the piece of music in question, that would depend on how many days that would take me to kind of busk through it, which would then bring me on to stage 3, fingers. Now, each time I played it through and I got to a point where I was familiar with how it goes and I was getting a little bit more confident with it and coming out of the busking stage, so to speak, then I would get to work on the finger numbers first. So I would actually then just stop and sort that little bit of fingering out. If it got to a point where, you know, they just need a little bit of tweaking, then I'd bust out the old pencil and I'd start writing in some finger numbers and just sit down and sort that little bit out separately. And I would start to kind of do that as I got more familiar with the piece. So don't forget, I've been busking this through for a few days first just to kind of get a feel for it. Then as I'm coming out of that busking stage and I'm getting more familiar with it, then at some point I've got to sit down and actually figure out what fingering I'm going to do for real. And then that sets the scene for the rest of it. Moving on to number 4, positions. Now, I wouldn't do this until I was happy with all the fingering. So what I would then do is, once I kind of got all my basic and preliminary finger numbers put in all over the music, I would then probably sit down and think to myself, what kind of tone do I want to create? What kind of sound do I want to create with this? And maybe think about whether I wanted to change any position. So maybe I was playing something on the E string, but I didn't want it quite so harsh and quite so loud. I might want to kind of soften that and mute that down a little bit and play the notes on the E string that I was going to play on the E string, play it on the A string in 3rd, 4th, or maybe even 5th position. Same goes if I had something on the D string, D, E, F, open D, first finger for E, second finger F, third finger G. For example, I might want to bring that over to the G string in 3rd position or 4th position, depending, and make it sound a little bit more velvety, a little bit more rich, slightly less vibrant and open, because that's what you're going to get by playing on the open strings. But maybe I don't want that sound to be. Maybe I want it to be a little bit more soft and a little bit more velvety, and that's what you're going to get by taking it up into those higher positions. So once I have played the piece through, so I've been busking it to get an idea in my head, then I've gone through with all the fingerings to make sure that, you know, everything is fine and I'm kind of happy with all that. Then I would actually start to really think about whether I did want to move some places into different positions or not. And that's kind of personal preference. You don't have to do that. You can just do, you know, what the music tells you to do. If the music says move up into 3rd position, go into 3rd. If it says go into 5th, go into 5th. Whatever the music tells you to do. But I like to just go a little bit above and beyond that and see if I can just play around with it and create different sounds and different tones by playing in different parts of the violin. But as I say, that would be the last thing that I would do from the fingering kind of part of, you know, the music. So once I've done that, number 5 I think we're at, the bowing. So at this point, I'm not even thinking about the bowing. I don't care who's slurring, who's phrasing, you know, I'm just going to be playing it all separate bows. I might be putting in the odd slur here or there, but mostly I'd probably just be playing it separate bows, or I'd just be playing however the bow, however I wanted to bow, because I'd be too busy concentrating on what I'm going to be doing with the left hand than what I'm going to be doing in the right hand. So this is where I would then start to put in the bowing. So that would be slurs, staccato, marcato, martelé, staccato, spiccato, you know, anything kind of like that would be bow related. And I would practice and not move on until I had this. So far we've sorted out the notes, we've sorted out the fingers and positions, and now we've sorted out the bow. And I wouldn't want to move on from any of those 3 until I was kind of happy with that. And by the time I get to the end of that, that's going to give me a pretty decent sounding, almost finished performance. Not polished, but a decent sounding finished performance. Rhythm. At this point, I'd want to make sure the rhythm is spot on and that I may pop the metronome on to do this. So this would be going through any passages that are 16th notes, semiquavers, demi-semiquavers, you know, anything like that, anything that's going to be quite fast or quite fiddly or quite intricate to do. And again, I might just put the metronome on if I was playing something like that. If I was playing something a little bit more romantic, then obviously I wouldn't put the metronome on, because I don't really want to stifle the romanticism by putting on a metronome, unless it was a passage that had a very tricky specific rhythm that I couldn't quite do. Then I would put the metronome on, figure that rhythm out in my head, you know, and I would use it for that kind of more for that purpose. Playing with the metronome as well is obviously great for highlighting any issues that you might be having with the notes, the bowing, the fingers, the position, or the rhythm. And again, I would not want to move on until this was perfect. So then we want to move on to musicality. So this is where I would begin to phrase the music. I'd begin to put dynamics in, any music direction that I could see on the music, the way the composer intended. And this is where I might go back and listen to my favourite violinist, or whatever interpretation, play it again, just so that I could re-invoke the inspiration and the love that I had for the piece in the first place. So remember, at this point I can actually play the piece. I've got all the bowing, the fingering, all of that kind of down, and now I'm looking to add the musicality to it. So we're still not at the polishing stage. We haven't even got there yet. We're at the musicality stage. So we're adding colour, we're adding variation in there. We're giving it a little bit more of a personality. So again, it's been a long time since I would have heard the original recording, so I would go back, listen to the recording to get more of a feel and think, yeah, that's the kind of colour I want to give it, that's the kind of tone I want to give it, just to give me a few extra ideas. So this is when I would put all of those bits into the music, any dynamics, loud, softs, sforzados, anything like that that's in the music. That's when I would go and work on and add those into the music. The next stage after that, I would add a piano backing to it as well. So I would now want to play with the piano, either a recorded MP3 of that, if I could get hold of one somehow, or a real life pianist, which would actually be ideal, but even I don't have access to a real life pianist anymore, so I would have to kind of get hold of an MP3 recording, which is okay. Obviously it's not great if you're wanting to do this as a live performance, but then that you'd be different. You'd have a live pianist that you'd be practicing with anyway. But if you're just sort of practicing in in your own environment, an MP3 would be fine. And there are kind of ways around that. If you get a really good MP3 that has been recorded by a professional pianist, then they will put some of those nuances and little pauses and little rests and slow, bits where they've slowed down and sped up and things. But, the only problem with that is that you're having to kind of go with their interpretation. But I mean, it's better than nothing, really. So, there are ways around it, but I would just want to play it with a piano, so it felt more complete to me. And then the final part of this would be the polishing part. And this is the part that I love to do, and the part I'm very, very good at doing. And also the part that most people never do. By the time they play it with the piano, they've added all the musical side of it, the dynamics and, all that kind of thing. And they think they're done with it. But to me, it's not about what's on the music with all the dynamics and the marking, but it's what's not on the music. It's reading between those lines. It's thinking about an interpretation and then interpreting that interpretation. But it's something like that requires quite a degree of skill, I think, because you've really got to know your way around music in general. But it's not just about knowing that piece. I like to know the history of the piece. So obviously I like to know who wrote the piece, so I kind of know what kind of genre I'm working in. But, what's the background to the piece? Why did the composer write the piece? Were they going through something in their life at the time? Were they going through a death? Was it a marriage? Was it a happy time, a sad time, depressing time? What kind of time was it? Because that's going to give me quite a large clue onto how I'm going to interpret this. So if I'm playing something that's very depressing by Beethoven, I'm not going to be playing it in a very light and jovial way, because it's going to be depressing. So I'm going to want to kind of draw on some of those feelings to kind of put that into my playing. But I like to also know how the composer writes as well, and more about the composer. So not just about the piece itself, but the composer. And once you kind of unravel that and look into that, it does give you a much wider insight on how things are to be played. And like I said, when you're listening to someone else's interpretation, you're listening to their interpretation, but where did they get their interpretation from? How did they come to that interpretation? They didn't just, get lucky and it just fell in their lap and it just, they just plucked it out of the air. They've got that interpretation from somewhere as well. And that is what we're trying to draw on. So this kind of part is almost impossible to teach, as it's more instinctive than a kind of methodology. you know, but it's once you do a little bit of research and the more pieces you play, the easier you're going to find it to kind of put in your own interpretation. So there we go. Thank you very much for watching. I will see if I can try and drop something in the notes underneath so you've got all this written out for you. But you know, basically it's just about sorting out the notes, sorting out the fingers, then the position, then the bow, then the rhythm, then the musicality and putting it with a piano, and then finally polishing a piece of music. So I hope you have enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you on next week's video. Bye.